Hey there folks, Tim Slade here, and welcome back to the ATD Ask a Trainer video series. In today's episode, my special guest Brian Washburn and I are answering your questions about designing blended learning. So stick around. You know, one of the things I've always said about learning is that it's a process, not an event. And that the act of learning is an ecosystem of experiences that people have over time. And that's why it's our job as instructional designers, e-learning developers, trainers, and just everyday learning professionals to create training experiences that support the learning process over time. And one way to do that is by designing blended learning. So how do you do that? Well, that's exactly why I decided to invite Brian Washburn to join me and help me tackle your questions about designing blended learning. So let's get to it. Hey, Brian, thank you so much for joining us for this month's episode. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing fantastic. So as I mentioned, in the introduction a moment ago, blended learning, one of the things I've always believed, like I said, is that learning is a process. It's not an event. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways we can do that is through blended learning. And I'm so happy to have you here because I know you just put out a book on sort of designing blended learning. What's your formula? But before we talk a little bit about that, before we get into some of the questions we have, take a moment to introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about, who you are and what you do.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm Brian Washburn. I am the co-founder and CEO of a company called Endurance Learning. And what we do is we'll put together learning programs for organizations. So it can be in-person or virtual or e-learning. And then we also have a software tool called Soapbox, which helps people to put together training programs, instructor-led training programs a little bit faster, get people about 50 or 60% of the way there before they start putting their own content. So it gives them activities and things like that. So that's a little bit about what we do. As you mentioned, I also have a book that ATD Press put out in June called What's Your Formula? Mm-hmm. And I'm just an all-around training nerd as well. So I like to hang in the training circles on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Good. Awesome. Yeah. Well, great. Well, we have some awesome questions about designing blended learning and how to go about designing it. So you're ready to help me tackle some questions?
Let's do it.
Cool. All right. So our first question comes from Karthik Richard. Hey, Karthik. Karthik wants to know, what are some of the common challenges when designing blended learning and how do you get around these? This is an interesting question because I think, I don't know if this has been true for you, Brian, but one of the things I've seen a lot of folks get stuck into this idea that when you're designing a training program, it's this binary choice between one thing or another. Like it's either e-learning or instructor-led training or a job aid or how-to video. And my response is always like, why does it have to be one thing or another? So I don't know. What are your thoughts? That's, I think, a common challenge a lot of people have, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that in order to have this conversation, the first thing we want to do is define what is blended learning, right? And absolutely. So the idea because it can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. I've been to different conference sessions about blended learning and people use it in different ways. And so for the purposes of this discussion, whether or not people agree with this definition, just for the purposes of the discussion so that we're talking about the same thing, I consider blended learning anytime that you are combining more than one delivery method as part of a learning experience. And so it can be, e-learning or a video in advance of a in-person session, or you can use the college model, which is, doing some online asynchronous work and maybe some discussion forums and reading a book, and then you're attending class. So that's what I think that's what we'll talk about when we're talking about blended learning here.
I agree.
But getting to the question, in terms of the challenges, I think it goes back to what you were saying. When we in kind of the learning and development space think of learning, it should be a process and not an event. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that oftentimes if you want to incorporate a blended approach to something, your expectations might not be in sync with the learner's expectations, because I think traditionally people have just thought, let me go to the training, whether it's in person or webinar, or let me take the course online. Let me check that off, get something out of it. Awesome. And then let me get back to my desk. And I think that one of the biggest problems is that incongruity with expectations. And so when we design something that is blended, we're adding a level of complexity on a number of different levels.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have is learner expectations that need to be set. Hey, this is going to be a thing where we need to do some work in advance. Getting people to do pre-work is always difficult.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have the learning event, and then we're going to give job aids or whatever it might be afterwards. And so in order to get that certificate of completion, and this is one of those things that sometimes people look for or need to show
Mm-hmm.
that they've completed an experience, in order to get that certificate of completion, sometimes we'll hold it until they've done everything that they need to do,
Sure.
including reporting back in terms of how have they been using something on the job. The
Yep.
other challenge with blended learning is from a design perspective. Anytime you're doing more than one kind of modality or more than one delivery method, you might not be an expert in that, right? So people who
Mm-hmm.
do instructor-led training aren't necessarily experts in e-learning design, and vice versa. Or people who are doing some sort of learning event may not always think about, oh, why don't we have a job aid for people to be
Right.
able to use afterwards? And so being able to figure out what are all those different elements that you want to put together can also lead to that level of complexity, which can be a challenge.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think to your point, I've never thought about it from the learner standpoint, learner expectations. I think of it same thing, but from a stakeholder standpoint, like the expectations we have to set with them that one course we're going to create is not going to solve their issue. It's going to take
Hmm.
time. I remember, and also helping them understand how each modality you might be creating supports one another. I remember
Yep.
I had one stakeholder when we would design, a multi-modality blended learning approach. She would review, the first item that we created. And if it were supposed to, have topics A, B, and C covered, she'd look at it and go, well, it has topic A, but not B and C. And then she would look at the second item and go, well, it has item B, but not A and C. And then the third one, she'd look at, go, oh, it has topic C, but not A and B. And then, and she wasn't looking at it holistically, right?
Hmm.
And so I think part of it, to your point, with learner expectations, is also stakeholder expectations to help them see the bigger picture and
Yep.
help them understand that, yes, training is an event, but learning is a process, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that
Good.
training can be one piece of it, right? But it's not
Right.
the
Yes.
whole experience.
Yeah. And that maybe part of that blended learning experience is, or are those stakeholders or those leaders participating in that
Hmm.
process with
Yep.
coaching and feedback
Yep.
and realigning expectations. It's not just all training, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Thank you, Karthik. Hopefully that answers your question. All right. Our next question comes from Laura Faria. I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, Laura. Laura wants to know, when is blended learning most effective and when should it be avoided? That's a great question, because I think sometimes people create blended learning, like they overcompensate when they're trying to accomplish something simple, and
Hmm.
and they, create something more complex that's beyond fit for function for what you're trying to achieve. So what are your thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, and you sent me the questions in advance, right? So
Yeah.
as I was doing a little bit of research on this, I was reminded of an article that Will Thalheimer published called "Does E-Learning Work?"
Mm,
And I love Will Thalheimer stuff. He takes a look at all sorts of research, all sorts of academic stuff. He'll synthesize it, and then he puts it into language that we can understand, which
sure.
I really appreciate,
Yeah.
having somebody like that in our space. And his article talks about the idea that when it takes a look at a bunch of different studies, so it's a meta-analysis of all these different studies, and it basically, one of the conclusions came out that that e-learning can be more effective than instructor-led training, and yet blended learning is more effective than either
Mm,
e-learning alone or
sure.
instructor-led alone. Now he had a lot of different. I mean, you have to take a look at the report if you want to
Sure.
get
Yeah,
the full
absolutely.
thing, right? And there's always exceptions to this. But the idea, and going back to Laura's question, when is blended learning most effective? It's always more effective according to this study, right? And so, and there's reasons for it, and part of that is because when you're blending different delivery methods, oftentimes you're spacing the learning. And so the research behind spacing your learning means that people will retain it longer. And if
Yep.
you can't retain it, then you can't apply it. And that's the ultimate goal for learning programs, is that people can change something or do something new or differently or better. And so if you can't remember what you learned, then it's tough to do things new or differently better. And so I think that the short answer to that is that it's almost always a better, according to the research, a better, more effective way to deliver training. Now, there's a couple of times that I can think you
Hmm.
might want to avoid it. One would be maybe in an emergency situation, right? You don't have time
Sure.
to put together and do really good design. One example that I had, as I was talking about this recently with somebody else, like, is training ever an emergency? Not
Mm.
usually, but there are some times. I worked for an organization that worked in the foster care system, and we had a situation where there was a compound that was
Oh,
kind
wow.
of a religious compound that was raided, and all these children were taken out of the compound, taken away from their families, and put into foster care. And
Hmm.
I had a day to put together a webinar to educate the professionals that would go in and start to into the foster care system and start to work with these children in terms of what the professionals needed to know about the children and about the context that they were coming from, so they could actually engage
Sure.
with the children. You're not going to put together a blended program, in 24 hours to do something like that.
Yeah.
That said, even in that case, you can still distribute the slides or make some sort of job aid afterwards that people can refer to, a quick reference guide or things like that. Another situation might be a situation in which a job aid is just the best answer, right? And so
Yep.
we don't need to do training. We just
Yep.
need to put together a job aid and let people know that we don't need to sit down for 30 minutes or 60 minutes about how to connect our sound to the conference room
Sure.
kind of AV equipment. Just
Yep.
put a job aid there, and that will
Yeah.
work. So I think those might be a couple instances when you might want to avoid it. But in general, I think that it's almost always a more effective delivery method than other modalities alone.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it ultimately comes down to being super intentional about why you're designing anything the way you're designing it. I mean, I oftentimes think, you know, going back to the conversation about is e-learning more effective, when you really ask yourself, like, why are you even developing e-learning? A lot of times, and not to say that this is right or wrong, it's always contextual, but a lot of times the reasons we develop e-learning has nothing to do with benefiting the learner. It benefits
Hmm.
the organization because you can
Yep.
create it once, deliver it multiple times to
Yep.
multiple people in multiple locations. And so whether you do an e-learning or just a job aid or a combination of things, it's just being super intentional, I
Yep.
think.
Yep.
And also like knowing your audience, what level of expertise, like, if you're teaching a bunch of subject matter experts some additional information about their area of expertise, maybe they don't need a full-blown training.
Correct.
Maybe they
Yep.
just need some, a resource or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Or new research or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Very good. All right, Laura, hopefully that answers your question. All right, our third and final question comes from Monique Babin. Hi, Monique. Monique wants to know, what new developments in learning design do you think are making the biggest impact on blended learning options? I mean, I think the obvious one's technology. And I don't know if this is the development, but it's making it more interesting is remote work. But what are your thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I wish I had a cooler answer for this, because
Yeah.
I think that there are some really cool technologies out there. Our friends Betty
Yeah.
Danowitz and Destry Hildenbrand are always talking about augmented reality or virtual reality. I haven't played too much in that world. One of the areas where I think over the past year and a half that has really changed is the feature set that is available in virtual learning platforms.
Sure.
When the pandemic hit, and everybody had to go almost overnight from doing lots of stuff in person to everything had to be virtual.
Hmm.
I think that at the time, you had Zoom that had certain features, breakout rooms and polling and things like that. You had Microsoft Teams that lots of people were using that didn't have breakout rooms, that didn't have lots of other features. I don't even know if you could do polling, a year and a half ago with Microsoft Teams.
Sure.
Now, I think that a lot of the different platforms are now very similar. They've realized this is where everybody's going. And so a year and a half ago, if you were to take a look at blended learning solutions when people were just trying to go virtual, I think it
Hmm.
was a disaster. Because people were trying to do in-person delivery using Zoom or using Teams or using Adobe Connect or whatever they had.
Yeah.
And I think that people were very uncomfortable with what was what they were being asked to do. People didn't necessarily know, both in terms of delivery and also being on the receiving end of that, while you're also trying to homeschool your kids that are at home and things like that. I think that one of the biggest, most ubiquitous changes over the past year and a half has been kind of the leveling of the playing field. Doesn't matter what virtual platform you have now, and I think that people are more comfortable both on the receiving end of the learning as well as the design and delivery of virtual learning to make that a little bit more engaging. Now, going back to this question about what new developments in learning design are making the biggest impact on blended learning, I wish I had a cooler answer, but I think a lot of it goes back to the fundamentals, and making sure that when you have to design something, that you are making sure that you're giving people an opportunity for realistic practice, that you
Mm-hmm.
are giving people realistic context in which they can explore. I mentioned that research from Will Thalheimer a little bit ago, and that was one of his conclusions. E-learning is more effective than in-person if, or
Mm-hmm.
because it gives you an opportunity to do some realistic simulations that you might not be able to do in person.
Sure.
But if in person you're doing that, then you also get kind of the same effect in terms of the effectiveness of that delivery. But with blended learning, I think maybe one of the biggest developments is just there's more and more research that's out there that says this is how it can be done. There's a book called Make It Stick, which
Mm-hmm.
also talks about the idea of a couple of different concepts, both that spaced learning, and then they have a term called interleaving, which is basically bringing in old stuff that you learned uh, in a previous session and reminding you of it in a new session and maybe in a new context. So
Yeah.
I think there's lots of stuff out there that we can be reading, researching, and absorbing in order to make our design even better today than it was a year ago.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, the only thing I think I can add to that is I think I've seen, yes, and I think it's been promoted more through the pandemic and people working in these new and different ways is embracing not only what already exists online for
Hmm.
learning
Yep.
opportunities, but allowing people to use their own devices. I remember speaking to somebody, and they're an instructional designer at a major retailer. And I used to work in retail, and it used to be a big no-no for employees to have their own cell phones and devices. And they decided to embrace it and allow their learners, their retail employees, to access learning content from their own device. And I think then that expands into, I remember I used to work in an organization. We would get asked, like, "Can you create some training on Microsoft Excel?" And my response was always like, "Why are we doing this? There's anything that they need, they can go, they get self service on, but
Yep.
they couldn't because they didn't have access to like YouTube. So we're like, let's just get them access to YouTube and let them, like, if they have a question, they can just Google it, or we can curate maybe a playlist of items for them." Because they were already kind of doing that on their phone, even though they weren't supposed to. So let's just embrace what's already really happening.
Yep.
So I think that's been a change and maybe more adopted since the pandemic. I would say for
Yep.
sure. So
Yep, I think that's spot on in terms of people being able to use their own devices, and also having to design for
right.
a variety of devices. And because you have to design for a variety of devices, there are some cool tools out there that people that I know that my team is using now, where you can kind of use one tool online
Mm-hmm.
to see what something would look like either in iOS
Yep.
or in Google platform or whatever it might be, and that's also kind of so there are I think there's lots of other technologies out there that make it's just making stuff easier in
Yep.
order to make sure that we have good learning.
I agree. Well, good. Well, thank you for that question, Monique, and hopefully that answers your question. All right. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. For everyone out there, if you haven't done so already, make sure to check out Brian's book, What's Your Formula? And we'll put the link down below. But, Brian, if people want to follow you, connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my preferred method of connecting with people. I'm also on Twitter at FlipChartGuy, and on Mondays and Thursdays there is a blog post that comes out from me or somebody from my team at trainlikeachampion.blog.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian.
All right, thanks, Tim.
All right. I think that's all we have time for today. Of course, I want to thank Brian for joining me to help me tackle those awesome questions. And as always, a big thanks to everyone who submitted a question for this month's episode. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube and you want to get alerted the next time we publish our next episode of ATD Ask a Trainer, make sure to click that subscribe button below. And of course, make sure to check out the ATD Ask a Trainer advice column by clicking on the link in the description. My name is Tim Slade, and until next time, I'll see you around.